The door creaked behind him as Paul Walker stepped into the audition room, and for a brief second, the world seemed to shrink into a tight, breathless corridor of fluorescent light and muted tension. There was nothing glamorous about that space. No framed movie posters celebrating past victories. No warm smiles. No sense of welcome. Only a long table with 3 people sitting behind it, armed with pens, coffee cups, and expressions carved from impatience. Paul felt the weight of their gaze before anyone said a single word, and that gaze alone told him everything. Today would not be easy. Today would test the part of him he rarely showed. The part that burned quietly behind the blue-eyed calm the world often mistook for simplicity. He walked forward with measured steps, though he could feel himself rehearsing each movement. His hands, steady but warmer than usual. His breathing, deep but deliberate. He had auditioned hundreds of times, but this one felt different, heavier, as if the room itself had decided to judge him before he even introduced himself. There was a stillness in the air, the kind that always appears before something breaks, and Paul knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would linger far longer than the audition itself. The producer didn't even look up at first. He kept tapping his pen against the edge of the table, an irregular, impatient rhythm that echoed through the room. When he finally lifted his eyes, they were colder than the air conditioning humming in the background. He skimmed Paul from head to toe, not with curiosity, but with conclusion. Paul had seen that look before, the "here comes the pretty boy" look, the silent accusation that he was all surface, no depth. Someone cast for posters and smiles rather than emotion. It was the look that had followed him for years, and the one he had spent just as long trying to outrun. "Name?" the producer asked, though he clearly already knew it. Paul answered anyway, polite, steady, refusing to let irritation sharpen his tone. The producer sighed, leaned back in his chair, and finally spoke the words that cut through the entire room. "You can't act." It wasn't a whisper or a reluctant critique. It was sharp and public, thrown across the table like a challenge or perhaps a warning to everyone else in the room. Don't expect anything from this guy. A couple of the assistants shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, their eyes darting between Paul and the man who had just dismissed him with such precision. The silence that followed was thick, carrying with it a mix of humiliation, disbelief, and something deeper. Something that hurt not because it was new, but because Paul had heard versions of that same sentence his entire life. For a moment, Paul didn't move. He didn't swallow, didn't blink. He just stood there, letting the sting of the words wash over him until it dissolved into something steadier. He had learned long ago that pain could be a kind of fuel if he chose to burn it the right way. So he breathed in, slow, deep, as though drawing strength from a place no one else could see. And then he looked the producer directly in the eyes. "I'd like to read," he said, voice low but carrying an unexpected gravity. The producer smirked, leaning forward with a theatrical sigh, as if granting a child permission to make a mistake. "Fine," he said. "Go ahead, show me." Paul opened the script, though he didn't really need it. He had spent hours with those lines, not memorizing them like a student, but absorbing them like a heartbeat. When he spoke the first sentence, it was calm, almost too soft, but there was something beneath it. A tension, a vulnerability, a truth that vibrated faintly like the first note of a song destined to swell. As he continued, something undeniable began to unfold in the room. The casting assistant lowered her pen, her brows softening in surprise. Another team member leaned forward, elbows pressing into the table, captivated despite himself. Even the producer's expression shifted, so subtly at first that no one noticed. A twitch of the jaw, the slightest narrowing of the eyes, the kind of micro-reaction that only appears when someone's reality begins to crack. Paul wasn't reading a script. He wasn't pretending to be the character. He was living it. Every hesitation, every breath, every trembling edge of pain or restraint felt organic, as though he'd carved the scene out of something buried deep inside him. Halfway through the audition, the room had become so silent that even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to retreat. Paul delivered a line that struck with the force of something both broken and unbreakable, and for the first time since he walked in, the producer's pen stopped tapping. And before we go any further into what happened in that room, tell me something. Where are you watching this from right now? Your comment not only helps this story travel further, it helps us understand how far these hidden stories reach. Paul kept going, unaware of the transformation unraveling around him. His voice carried a weight it hadn't carried before, like this moment had demanded he reveal a version of himself he usually hid. When he reached the final line, he let it fall slowly, deliberately, allowing the emotion behind it to echo in the air long after the words were gone. No one moved. The producer's face was different now, stripped of arrogance, stripped of dismissal. His mouth opened slightly, as though he needed air, as though he had just witnessed something he couldn't categorize. Then, in a gesture that left the entire room stunned, he pushed his chair back and stood. The apology came out louder than anyone expected. "I was wrong," he said, voice tight with something like humiliation and awe tangled together. "I shouldn't have said that." No one had ever seen him apologize before, not publicly, not sincerely. But here he was, humbled in front of the very actor he had dismissed only minutes earlier. Paul didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded with the quiet dignity that had always set him apart. And in that moment, something shifted. Not just for the people in the room, but for Paul himself. It wasn't validation. It was revelation. The realization that all the assumptions others made about him were too small to contain what he carried inside. That audition became a whispered legend in the halls of casting studios, a reminder that you never truly know someone's depth until you give them the space to reveal it. And as we move deeper into the layers of Paul's journey, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this story. What comes next is even more powerful. The apology echoed in Paul's mind long after he had left the room. It wasn't the words themselves that stayed with him. It was what they represented. In Hollywood, apologies were rare currency, given only when the weight of truth could no longer be ignored. As he walked back through the sterile hallway of the studio, the hum of fluorescent lights seemed distant, almost insignificant compared to the rhythm of his own thoughts. That single moment, a producer's surrender to his undeniable talent, marked the beginning of something Paul had always believed, but had never been allowed to prove. That he was more than a face on a poster, more than the ocean blue eyes that had made casting directors see him as a type instead of a person. That day, he had forced the industry to look beyond the surface. But success, especially in Hollywood, rarely unfolds like a straight road. It's a winding path, lined with mirrors that distort and amplify everything: your triumphs, your mistakes, your image. After that audition, Paul began to receive more calls, but with them came the same unspoken expectations. He was the pretty one, the safe one, the California guy. Casting agents wanted his charm, his effortless presence, his warmth. What they didn't want was his complexity. It was as if the very thing that made him human was a flaw the camera wasn't supposed to capture. For years, Paul would struggle with that contradiction, being loved for something he could never control while fighting to be seen for something he had always carried inside. He grew up with simplicity in his bones, the kind of simplicity that comes from long drives along the coast, from salt wind and quiet evenings that teach you how to listen more than speak. His upbringing wasn't marked by glitter or fame. His family was grounded, humble, deeply rooted in the ordinary rhythms of life. Paul had always been fascinated by people, by what made them break and what made them heal. Acting, for him, wasn't about pretending. It was about reaching that part of human truth that most people were afraid to show. That's why rejection hurt. Not because it bruised his ego, but because it made him feel unseen. In the late 90s, Hollywood was hungry for stereotypes. You were either the rebel, the heartthrob, the funny one, or the villain. There was no room for nuance, but Paul didn't fit neatly into any of those boxes. He was too calm to be the rebel, too introspective to be the shallow heartthrob, too grounded to be the comic relief. He existed in the quiet spaces in between, the places where emotion wasn't loud, but real. It took years before someone would see that, before someone would hand him a script that didn't ask him to be an image, but a man. That moment came when he was cast in The Fast and the Furious. On the surface, it seemed like another action film. Adrenaline, cars, explosions. But for Paul, it was something else entirely. It was a chance to build something real, to create a brotherhood that mirrored the loyalty and depth he longed to portray on screen. His connection with Vin Diesel wasn't just chemistry for the camera. It was real friendship, born from shared respect and unspoken understanding. Vin saw what so many had missed, that beneath Paul's calm demeanor lived a restless fire, the kind that came from a man who didn't just want to entertain, but to matter. When filming began, Paul threw himself into the work with the same quiet determination that had carried him through rejection after rejection. He learned about engines, about racing, about the subculture that pulsed beneath Los Angeles. He didn't want to imitate a street racer. He wanted to become one. He spent hours with real drivers, asking questions, listening to their stories, studying how they spoke, how they moved, what drove them beyond the wheel. His authenticity began to bleed into the character of Brian O'Connor, a man torn between two worlds, trying to reconcile duty and heart. It wasn't acting anymore. It was reflection. But as fame grew, so did the shadows around it. The more beloved Paul became, the more invisible his private struggles were. He often spoke about how disconnected he felt from the fame machine, how superficial the industry seemed compared to the depth he searched for in life. Friends said he'd vanish for days, disappearing into the ocean with his surfboard or driving alone into the desert just to breathe without cameras. He wasn't built for the noise. He was built for silence, for realness, for the kind of peace that couldn't be sold or performed. Even as his name lit up billboards, he remained grounded. He never chased luxury, never played the part of the celebrity. He drove the same cars he loved before fame, wore the same clothes, kept his circle small. Yet there was always a quiet loneliness to him, something unspoken behind the easy smile and surfer charm. Perhaps it was the burden of being misunderstood, of being known by millions but truly seen by few. The people who worked closest with him often said Paul was too pure for Hollywood, that he cared too deeply, felt too deeply, in a place that rewarded masks. He'd spend hours talking about his daughter, about nature, about the fragility of time. There was a gravity to him, one that grew heavier as his fame expanded. He wasn't afraid of success, but he feared what it could take away, the simplicity that had once kept him whole. Every set, every role, every red carpet smile hid a man quietly questioning what it all meant. He never said it out loud, but those close to him felt it, that quiet tug between gratitude and disillusionment. The boy who once walked into an audition room determined to prove his worth was now a man trying to remember who he was before the world decided for him. And it's here that Paul's story turns deeper, darker, more fragile than anyone realized. Because behind every bright light in Hollywood, there's a shadow stretching just as far. What happened when Paul started to follow that shadow, when he began to search for meaning outside the fame that once defined him, would change everything that followed. If you're still with me in this story, make sure you're subscribed. What comes next isn't just about the actor Paul Walker. It's about the man behind the legend, and the fate that even he couldn't escape. There came a point in Paul Walker's life when the bright lights of Hollywood began to blur into something almost ghostly. Fame had given him everything: recognition, wealth, admiration, but it had also taken something intangible, something sacred. The boy who once stood in that audition room determined to prove he could act was now a man trying to find a reason to keep doing it. Success, he would later admit to friends, had started to feel hollow. It wasn't that he didn't love the craft. He did, deeply. But somewhere between film sets and red carpets, he had begun to lose the quiet spaces that made him feel alive. Paul had always been more ocean than city. He carried the rhythm of tides in his veins, steady, deep, unhurried. and in that stillness was his truth. When the cameras turned off, he would retreat to places untouched by fame. Sometimes it was the California coast, where he'd surf until sunset, with only the sound of the sea as company. Other times, it was remote parts of the world, Fiji, Costa Rica, the Pacific Islands, where no one cared about movie premieres or studio deals. Out there, he was just another soul watching the horizon, reminding himself that life was bigger than fame. But even peace has its price. Those who knew Paul said he carried an invisible restlessness, a quiet ache for something beyond what the world expected of him. Acting had become a cage disguised as freedom. Every role, every press interview, every fan interaction reminded him of the image people adored, the cool, effortless hero with the soft heart and sharp jawline. But Paul was deeper than that. He was curious about the universe, fascinated by the rawness of human experience. He could spend hours talking about faith, science, the fragility of nature. It was as if his soul was searching for something purer than fame, a truth that could outlast it. In 2010, that search began to take shape in a way that surprised everyone. He started Reach Out Worldwide, a humanitarian organization built not for headlines, but for help. When natural disasters struck, Paul didn't just write checks. He was there, physically there, digging through rubble, carrying supplies, comforting families who had lost everything. Those who joined him on missions described him as tireless, covered in dirt and sweat, smiling through exhaustion. Fame didn't follow him there. It wasn't invited. It was the one place where Paul felt completely real again. He once said that helping others reminded him of what mattered most, that we're all temporary, that time is fragile, that love and kindness are the only currencies that mean anything when the world falls apart. The more he traveled, the more he saw, and the more that Hollywood began to feel like a world of glass. Beautiful, yes, but breakable, hollow, and easily shattered. He was torn between two worlds, the one that made him a star, and the one that made him human. His friends often joked that Paul seemed too good for the industry, but beneath that was a truth they didn't fully understand. Paul wasn't running away from fame. He was quietly grieving it. The same cameras that once validated him now felt like barriers. He longed to live without being watched, to love without being photographed, to exist without explanation. He wanted to be a father, a friend, a man who left something behind that wasn't just a film franchise. The years leading up to his death were filled with moments that felt almost prophetic. He would often tell close friends that he didn't expect to live long, that he felt a strange pull, not toward darkness, but towards something inevitable. It wasn't fear that colored his words, but acceptance, as if he somehow knew that his story would be short, but meaningful. There was a serenity in the way he spoke about it, a quiet surrender that only those who have made peace with impermanence can understand. The irony, of course, is cruel. The man who found peace in motion, who loved the sound of engines and the freedom of speed, would have his life taken by the very thing that symbolized that freedom. On November 30th, 2013, the world stopped. The car, the crash, the fire, headlines that felt impossible, unbearable, unreal. Fans flooded the internet with disbelief. Friends collapsed under the weight of grief. And the world suddenly realized how much light had left it. But behind the collective shock was a quieter kind of mourning. Not for the actor, but for the man they were only beginning to truly see. Vin Diesel's reaction said everything words could not. He didn't lose a co-star. He lost a brother. The bond they had built on screen had been more than cinematic chemistry. It was real family, one that transcended fame and fiction. When Vin stood before the crowd at Paul's memorial, his voice broke not as a movie star, but as a man crushed by absence. The entire Fast and Furious cast echoed the same truth. Paul wasn't just the heart of the franchise, he was its soul. The final scenes Paul filmed for Furious 7 became a cinematic farewell that felt more like destiny than design. When the film's closing montage played, Brian driving into the sunset, smiling, Millions of people cried not because of fiction, but because the story had somehow become reality. It wasn't a character driving away. It was Paul, immortalized in the only way art can truly preserve a soul, through emotion. That final scene didn't just end a movie, it sealed a legacy. A man who began his career being told, "You can't act," left behind one of the most emotionally enduring farewells in modern cinema. The same calm that carried him through rejection, through fame, through heartbreak, it carried him home. And though his life ended in tragedy, his essence became something untouchable. His kindness, his authenticity, his quiet strength, they outlived the fire. And if you've been following this story so far, let me ask you something. What do you remember most about Paul Walker? Was it the speed, the smile, or the silence between both? Leave your thoughts below. They help keep his memory alive in ways that numbers never could. Before we step into the final chapter of his story, where legacy meets eternity, make sure you're subscribed. The ending of Paul's journey isn't just about death. It's about what it means to live so purely that the world remembers you forever. There are lives that fade quietly, disappearing into memory like smoke into the wind. But then there are others, rare, luminous, that refuse to vanish, even after the light goes out. Paul Walker's story belongs to the second kind. More than a decade after his death, his name still carries the echo of something sacred, something that feels less like loss and more like a lingering heartbeat. His passing didn't end the story, it transformed it. It turned a man into a symbol, a memory into a movement, and a fleeting life into a kind of immortality that few ever reach. In the years following the tragedy, fans continued to gather at the crash site, not because they sought closure, but because they wanted connection. The place became almost spiritual, a space where the line between grief and gratitude blurred. People left notes, photographs, car keys, and letters addressed to a man they had never met but somehow felt they knew. They spoke of his humility, of his warmth, of how his energy seemed untouched by the vanity that consumed so many others in his world. The candles, the engines revving in tribute, the silence that followed. It all became a ritual, a testament to the kind of presence that doesn't need to be seen to be felt. Paul's family carried the weight of that legacy with quiet grace. His daughter Meadow, only 15 at the time of his passing, became a living reflection of everything he stood for. She grew into his kindness, his sense of purpose, his calm defiance of fame. In time, she founded the Paul Walker Foundation, an organization built to continue his humanitarian vision. Through ocean conservation, disaster relief, and educational programs, Meadow ensured her father's mission didn't stop where his life had ended. It was a continuation, a reminder that even in absence, Paul was still reaching out worldwide, just as he had dreamed. Vin Diesel too carried Paul's memory like a brother's promise. Every red carpet, every interview, every Fast and Furious film that followed bore traces of that loyalty. Vin often said he still felt Paul's presence on set, that there were moments during filming when he'd glance at a car or a shadow and swear his friend was right there. The brotherhood they shared went beyond screenwriting. It was real, raw, and permanent. When Vin named his daughter Pauline, it wasn't for publicity, it was for remembrance. A way to keep a piece of his brother alive in the most personal way possible. But perhaps the most haunting part of Paul's story is how deeply he seemed to understand impermanence before it found him. Interviews from years before his death reveal a man who spoke often about time, how fleeting it was, how easily wasted, how fragile it made us. He said once that life isn't about how fast you go, but how deeply you feel along the way. And in those words lives the entire truth of who he was. He didn't chase fame, he stumbled into it. He didn't crave attention, he tried to use it as light for others. Even at his peak, he was already preparing to live differently, to spend more time with his daughter, to disappear into the ocean, to let the noise fade away. Fate just didn't give him that chance. Yet in some strange, poetic way, maybe Paul did get what he was chasing all along. Because what he left behind wasn't just a series of films or a name in Hollywood's archives. It was a spirit, a sense of quiet decency in a world addicted to chaos. His co-stars still speak of how he brought calm to every room, how his laugh could diffuse tension, how his kindness felt almost disarming in an industry where authenticity was currency no one could afford. To them, Paul wasn't a star. He was an anchor, a reminder that humanity still existed beneath the fame. The Fast and Furious franchise carried on, but never the same. Each sequel became less about action and more about tribute, every scene tinted by the ghost of that brotherhood. The film's recurring theme, family, took on a deeper meaning because of Paul. It wasn't a slogan anymore, it was real grief translated into art. When his image reappeared digitally in later installments, fans didn't see it as technology. They saw it as resurrection, as a gentle reminder that he was still driving somewhere out there, smiling behind the wheel. But legacy is never built by fame alone. It's built by what remains when the applause fades. And for Paul, what remains is love. You can see it in the Foundation's work, in the annual tributes, in the fans who still write his name on car windows. You can see it in the way his co-stars still talk about him in the present tense, as if refusing to admit he's gone. You can see it in the millions of people who never met him, yet feel his story as if it were their own. Because deep down, everyone understands what it means to be underestimated, to fight to be seen, to love fiercely, and to lose too soon. There's a quiet beauty in how Paul's life continues to ripple through others. His story reminds us that impact isn't measured in years, but in presence. That you can live a short life, but live it fully. So fully that the world refuses to forget you. That the things you do when no one is watching often speak louder than everything you do under the lights. In that sense, Paul Walker's true legacy isn't about speed, fame, or film. It's about heart, the kind that keeps beating long after the engine stops. And maybe that's why his fans still feel connected to him. Because his story isn't about death, it's about living with intention. It's about the courage to stay kind in a world that rewards cruelty, about the strength to remain genuine when everything around you demands performance. Paul didn't just act, he lived his truth. And that truth continues to whisper through the years, through every ocean wave, every open road, every person who decides to give more than they take. So if you felt something through this story, if you've been moved by his journey, his humility, or the legacy that still carries his name, take a second right now, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell the world what Paul Walker meant to you, and keep his memory alive, not as a celebrity, but as a soul who reminded us that greatness isn't about being seen, it's about being felt. Because somewhere, beyond the noise of Hollywood, beyond the speed of fame, beyond the years that have passed, Paul Walker is still driving toward the horizon. Not gone, just free.